There comes a moment when you've exhausted all your options while simultaneously coming across a product that reinvents your notion about what an honest and high-quality company looks like. The Healing Rose was the catalyst to that very moment for me. The Healing Rose Company is a female-owned Massachusetts CBD company based out of Newburyport that prides themselves in using only the best USDA-certified organically sourced ingredients for their vast line of therapeutic products. Their line stretches from lip balms, tinctures, skin balms, roll-on oils, and bath products. Their transparency places them above the rest with third-party tested results showcasing their intolerance to toxic pesticides, solvents, metals, and harmful elements. They provide full-spectrum CBD in many of their products, excluding their tinctures, which carry a broad-spectrum profile, ideal for not having to worry about any low-level THC, which is common for many CBD products. That one's my favorite, and it's good on the palate. Full-spectrum means that they extract from the hemp plant an array of different therapeutic cannabinoids along with CBD and their profile terpenes. The combination results in a greater outcome of healing and relaxation for any individual's needs. Whether you are an athlete looking for any recovery advantage, a patient in need of some relief to remind yourself that you are still a warrior, or someone who sees the frontiers of life with a little reserve and want to calm the mental storms that keep you from personally exploring, the Healing Rose CBD Company is here for your full body and mind optimization. Please visit thehealingroseco.com to explore their diverse line of products and support one of New England's best rising stars in an industry where ethics are fundamental, and a company like this will only be found sitting at the throne of it all. Use the code SAGAS, S-A-G-A-S, for 10% off your purchase. Again, visit thehealingroseco.com and use the promo code SAGAS at checkout for 10% off your purchase. To the many martial artists, entrepreneurs, dreamers, and thinkers, how often, for your own sake, would you love a symbolic reminder of your mentality and the perfect dichotomy to match? Murder Nerd is an independent clothing apparel line that represents the sharp, relentless focus towards personal growth and athletics. It embodies the vitality of their creative owners and the network of people who run on the same frequency. Why not elevate your frequency in comfort and style? Visit www.murdernerdsfitness.com for their personal line of shirt and hat wear. Enter the promo code SAGAS, S-A-G-A-S, for 10% off your purchase. Again, visit murdernerdfitness.com and enter the promo code SAGAS for 10% off your purchase. So this is a special episode for me. I had a lot of hesitation and contemplation in sharing this story. I know events like this can be regarded as a highlight to the process of personal transcendence or transformation. They are held as deeply dissolving and bonding moments with oneself. So I understand the value of keeping these to yourself and working on the integration process slowly. But I also value the details in how someone may navigate through a psychedelic experience and the honesty in how the process affects their personal, unfortunate circumstances. There's a darker side to these profound occasions that I believe need to be understood and explored for the benefits it can settle onto us if we navigate them with a proper intention, unobstructed by panic. I say this to preface the idea that as amazing as this voyage was for me, I'd be irresponsible if I didn't set the tone that this is still a cautionary tale. I was fully surprised at where and how my experience spiraled and exploded. You can think you know what a heroic dose can feel like when it's unexplored and novel until you are pulled into an ego and sensory melting place where the happiest point in your life would be to get off this ride immediately. So as I read this short memoir I wrote in the weeks after that night, I want to thank anyone who listens to this with an open heart, an open mind, and a healthy amount of reserve. This is not meant for everyone, and I don't advocate doing something like this unless you're psychologically sound and emotionally prepared for the weight this process can cast upon you. This all ends well, and I'm forever changed by the magnitude of it all, but these adventures demand respect and an amount of courage that underpins an intention which should bind you to the reason you've even brought yourself to the experience. I hope in sharing that it opens the door further for honest conversations about why people do this and how many of us have come out the other side better than when we entered. Thank you again, and enjoy this very important and personal account of my journey. It's December 19th, 2020, and the weight of coming events started the moment that I woke up that day. Luck of the draw, my daughter was spending the night safe at her grandfather's home. I had full license to commit in the ceremony I so deeply needed, but that was laced in fear of the unknown. I had only told one friend and my wife of my plans. The hour was coming near. I wanted to start at about 5 to give time and space for the trek back. I surveyed the space days before and decided to navigate my voyage on the exercise mats in my garage. I set up space heaters, a blanket, pillow, and a string of warm decorative lights dangled above my head as I lay flat looking up at them. I wanted it to be the most conducive environment that mimicked a sacred place only suited for extreme emotional and mental hardship, something that echoed from the ancestors who'd been here before. I've shed countless tears and expelled much energy in my martial arts space. It was only fitting to honor the area in combating my darkest conflict, surrounded by it. The music was prepared, which consisted of ceremonial Icaros chants that led to hours of Sanskrit mantras to hypnotize me further away from my conscious, grounded self. My heart raced for an hour before the entire setup was ready, and with one big breath, sitting center of the blanket, I consumed 3.6 grams of psilocybin alone, and ready, or so I thought. I wore my loose white beach shirt that I purchased on my first pilgrimage to Nicaragua while visiting my family for the first time 10 years ago. Since then, I've worn that in significant moments like meeting my extended family in the country where its roots birthed my DNA, my first psychedelic experience, and my daughter's home birth, while my wife wore it through her contractions. It's the familiar hand that held us through many moments of transformation. As a protective measure, I also naively put on my jiu-jitsu team sweatshirt as a reminder of the resilience I've tried to cultivate in that endeavor, hoping it would serve as an anchor during potentially heavy tides. I was preparing for war in the search for my greatest adversary, that which would be the beast of my suffering. As the first Icarus played, I laid my head to the pillow as I faced the ceiling and the dancing, dangling orange lights that floated only a few feet from my face. Contemplation came as a few chants passed by, and time was telling me that nothing was happening. My anticipation was like that of a boy, waiting to finally meet a figure that only existed in folklore, or a man begging to have the oracles reveal themselves, exhausted of all his options. I began to worry that the fungi had not worked. But as I lay there on the edge of impatient disappointment, I see a flicker of purple and red catch my eye at the tips of the holiday lights, a colorful staple of what's visually expected. The ceiling began to breathe a bit, and the shadows flirted with a mandala design that I couldn't quite decide if it was something I was convincing myself to see, or the real beginnings of my excursion. The latter proved to be the true. Previous experiences with mushrooms never morphed into much of an emotional tension. They were filled with great meaning and insights, into a few mental hiccups I've had, but the spinning of a bullet into the heart of my pain was something that I deeply tried to assign this mission. It didn't take long for my chest to swell, My frustration morphed into a moment of pity in myself. I couldn't believe that my anguish brought me to being in a garage, rolled up in a blanket, taking psychedelics in the hopes that I don't ultimately hurt myself as a result of incapable coping over this life. As much as encouragement would have been the better promotion toward myself, I wallowed in the victimhood that screamed about how unfair this all was. Little did I know that it was the first domino to fall in the avalanche of grief that buried me thereafter. My mind bridged itself seamlessly from a self-centered sorrow to a heartache over a man I barely knew who had recently passed. For context, I had a patient of mine a few years back come into my lab, and through conversation I had discovered he was an advisor at the school I was attending to further my education. He was a sweet and incredibly helpful man that constantly helped me out with many of my logistical problems when it came to class selections and overall college questions. He was my inside guy. I also knew his wife, daughter, and 3 grandsons, all of which were high-achieving, sincere, and conservatively friendly people. From my point of view, he had done an incredible job with his family, and the proof was in the pudding. His health slowly declined, where many ailments came across as accidental, which would then slip into more systemic issues. I saw him less, but when I did, we shared much of our personal stories, including issues with my wife and his contemplation of death because of all his new conditions. I found out recently that he had passed from cancer. My reaction initially was shock, but rubbed it off a little more than I expected. In the first moments of reflection under these influences, he came to my mind, and I sobbed, lying there in the glow of my ceremony. It had begun. I mourned his death and grieved for the passing of an energy that manifested into an incredibly dedicated father figure. Somewhere in that space, I found time to declare that that was a vitality I will nurture, an energy that will ripple into the lives of my family and friends, where in my death there will be no room for questioning a life of love and a demise bounded by honor. He was a beautiful man. As that first wave calmed, I took some breath to center myself while allowing the tears to slide down the side of my temple onto the pillow beneath me. I could feel the physical effects of the mushrooms on my body, more of a buzz, but with all my cognition intact. From there, the weight became heavier. Only minutes had passed when I transitioned into seeing my friend. It was unexpected, but I began to grieve for him. It had felt that I needed to mourn the loss of his mother for him. His mother, who has one of the most debilitating cases of fibromyalgia, is a version of herself that is unrecognizable in comparison to who his mother was when he was a young boy. I felt such a deep sense of loss for him that the emotions that followed were the beginnings of a deep guttural bellow I've never expressed. I was in the heart of that situation and all of its potential miseries. I loved him and somehow thought that in feeling his pain to a subterranean depth, that it would haunt him less. It felt transcendental if I could assume I knew what that felt like. At this point, I had rolled up in the blanket, covering my face as I growled into the pain with intermittent whimpers and deep breaths in between. My mouth was thrusted into the pits of my arms. I would have looked lost and in urgency while swimming tangled in a bed of sheets. It felt like my sadness had taken control of my body and was forcing an exorcism of emotions I had neglected for far too long. Aware of it and unable to push the brakes. Effortlessly, as I rolled over to my other side, the thought of my own father came to me. His abandonment and mental issues were all but dissolved into a feeling of forgiveness. I pushed into that sadness even more. The idea felt that the more I physically groaned and leaned into it, the deeper a release of trauma would occur. I had no control over it. I had become a wounded animal, attacking the suppression that backed me into a corner. I grieved the idea of a father and son relationship. I made space for all my close friends who carried the burden of lost love from their father, and it all but broke me. I had never cried so much and so hard for anything my entire life. I almost couldn't believe I had done this to myself, but I welcomed it. Quickly thereafter, I rolled to my other side, which triggered thoughts of my own family. Ideas of being better and loving harder came to me. My moods fluctuated too often towards my daughter and my wife in the lead up to this day. I felt regret for allowing my untethered mind to possibly hurt the ones I loved the most. I mourned the loss of life that could have potentially lived through my wife if she hadn't become so sick. I was paralyzed in my fear over her. What I had surprisingly noticed was the lack of thought and hopelessness toward our circumstance. The absence of that idea actually made me feel restored, that our relationship had a great potential to look very different. When that manifests is something only time and proper effort will show. If I was to get any message, I surely assumed it would be over the bleakness of our future. But it scoffed at such a feeble notion. I was ecstatic behind the veil of lunacy playing out in the forefront. My body began to hurt from all the torque I had produced under this extreme state of lamentation. The exhaustion gave me a moment of reprieve to peek out from the blanket and emerge, only to feel a new layer of anxiety. I could feel on multiple levels how drained I'd become from the expelled bulk of hurt forced into the vanguard of this phase. The process seemed over, and there was a sense of conclusion that I embraced, but that came with some heavy bodily complications. As I sat there, nausea surfaced quickly, and this became the starting point to a parallel storyline, which would become the thread that carried me to the finale. That story was of my self-dialogue. As disentangled as I was, I still had the mind to problem-solve my way out of the gym. I had a realization that I couldn't stay in the garage. I was scared of illness due to the temperature. I needed to urinate, and I felt that I may be in a bit of distress due to the inability to comprehend my movements, never mind the expanding colors and texture my reality was breaking into. But in that minute, I brushed off and put myself in a state of encouragement to first find a way to pee and then get to the safety of my bed. Luckily, I found a way to venture through and around the garage in my socks to a half-full construction bucket, so I let loose. Afterwards, the back and forth of how to make my way through the door into my home was a daunting task. I was about to see my wife and her friends in the kitchen at the initial stage of my frightening descent. I held it together, and as I opened, then closed the door behind me, I took a right turn toward my stairs. I told my wife I was fine and asked if she could take care of the things I had left in my wake, which were all the space heaters, audio, and lights. I felt I needed help, but at this point, I still knew that there was nothing anyone could do for me. I was alone. Through the dizziness and slight nausea, my path lit up and became a stairway, crystallized in silver with shimmering gold edges. I was just going up my steps, but it felt like an ascension into another world, and that's exactly what came afterward. I opened the door to my room while making sure that it was kept open behind me. I entered and sat on the side of my bed. Shortly after clicking my table lamp on, I found myself nauseous yet again, contemplating where and if I should expel myself. As the sensation calmed down, I leaned back with an exhaustion that most certainly would have carried me into sleep any other night. My body was worn, but my mind was exploding and just beginning to peak. In shutting the light off, a buzz of panic and urgency amplified through me. The stages of visuals had begun, and blue pulsating dots that expanded into purple particles of dust around me gave me very little comfort in the idea that I hadn't started spiraling out of control. The inner monologue had changed to a rational and pragmatic coach, reassuring that their student had what it took to finish the race. I kept telling myself that I had done a good job and that you achieved the grieving you asked for. And now we are at a time of uncertainty, but waiting it out with a calm mind will be your only ally. This was where a period of intense waves would swell every few minutes. They became triggered by small states of composure and yawning. These moments were where I did as much reassuring as I could. I continuously flowed in between two very different states, where the minutes of reprieve became points to reset, which led into greater disillusion and deconstruction of my perceptual and physical views. Every oncoming session of intensity would bring on sights of rectangular digital puzzle pieces intertwined like a labyrinth, draped over every plane of my conceptual vision. My eyes were closed, but my reality was dissolving through the lens of a Mayan or Aztec-themed extravaganza. It was strange how ancient and digital this all was at the same time. It felt as if some sort of matrix was revealing itself, and I was slowly slipping further and further into that realm of existence, which forced me to eventually let go of the reality I was coming from. I struggled here and there with a frequency that felt almost malicious. I had small periods where this experience felt like it wanted to hurt me or give me the illusion that something negative was happening to me. But I had kept in my mind that there was a potential for this to momentarily turn south and to not give in to the natural unease of a possible ego death. A small but very integral piece of not giving in to my panic was the sound of laughter coming from my home below me. My wife and her friends were still enjoying themselves, and luckily every 20 minutes to a half hour, I would hear beautiful chuckles that would instantly articulate to me that there was still joy in the house, and that I need to hold on to that dynamism. Unfortunately, as the laughter became more mechanical sounding, further into this progressing phase, my ego death cared very little and divorced me from any comfort I had had before. At the peak of this experience, I would try to roll over and pretend that I would fall asleep, but what would happen was a stillness that had me knocking on the door of the expansive void, and by that time, I felt the welcomed withdrawal of my perceived sentient existence. It all became too heavy to combat, and in the face of what I thought was death, I reassured myself that I did my best in this life while allowing for a dimensional exodus to take me. I was a glowing machine, that had its pieces and utility taken apart like a Jenga tower at the end of a game. My limbs and thoughts were distilled into blackness. My head was twitching uncontrollably on the verge of some epileptic seizure. I wasn't sure if my heart had a rhythm any longer. I was reduced into a digital puddle, floating in an abyss that had no concern for phenomena. I was gone. I had expired. It's a unique thought to tell yourself that the idea in moving one's limbs is a game of ambiguous chance. I snapped back into a fleeting thought of cognition, just enough to command some movement. And like that, I put motion back in my arms. I had not died, but was over the hill of a profound point of sensory and self-uncoupling. I was back in the throes of ancient visual labyrinths, and the pulsating glow of a body buzzing on the brink of implosion. But I was cognizant of my breath, and that was a win in this arena. As quickly as I had unglued from my reality, I jolted into my return. The quivers I had been experiencing shook me back into my body, but the ride wasn't over. The pulsating, tapering pattern of the geometrical descent was becoming less and less intense, each interval feeling like a 10-minute stint. Though still in a state of shock, trying to secure that I was in my body with any remnants of my faculties, I found space to measure and analyze the severity of each spell in the hopes that I would feel it dissipating. The first signs of my ascension came from the lack of echo each word carried when I would check in and communicate with myself. Earlier, it had sounded like a language pressed through a filter of robotic echoes, resembling something out of a Transformer movie. Slowly, the reverb faded off the tip of my words, and the teal magnetic glow that engulfed my body had diminished as well. I had now entered into the afterglow stage. I had survived, and the distant horizon of my actual life was sitting in my lap again. I was overtaken by so much gratitude and awe that I began to weep and laugh all in the same breath. As exhausted as I felt, with sparks of the trip still flickering, I knew I had weathered the storm, victorious in the aftermath. I was able to check in on my phone and let my wife know that I was all right. The normal sight of my hand and device cemented that we were out of the thick of it. I was drawn to listen to something soft as I hissed back out of my expedition. I found some simple affirmations that would repeat over lax, non-abrasive synths. In the state I was in, I found these declarations to carry a tremendous amount of weight. It felt like a perfect end to my endeavor. I was imprinting real change through language at such an impressionable, hypersensitive time. I soaked that period in for quite a while. The novelty of my room and the glow of my phone onto the ceiling carried an appreciation that I assumed resembled that of a human coming out of a coma. This had become a petrifyingly philosophical and metaphysical reawakening. As my wife entered the room after requesting her at my bedside, I embraced her and wept tears of love, appreciation, and hope. I had returned to her, invigorated with hope only found in the most unlikely corners of this abyss. We chatted a bit about my indescribable trek. To anyone else, I would have come across delusional and in need of cessation from overexhaustion. But she understood the grandeur of what I was trying to relay. She knew the love her husband held towards his family could be the only persuader into unraveling his pain in this way for the betterment of their collective legacy. The letting go of any trepidation she had in allowing her husband to pursue something so foreign and potentially dangerous was something only the most devoted of lovers would endure. But she knew we would all reap the spoils if it unfolded in the way that we had hoped. She brought me fruit, and in that minute, I had never enjoyed an apple more than in that first bite. My dog finally came in to check in on his father. A few licks on the forehead were his "good job, Pops" gesture. Familiarity was like ecstasy to me now. Time passed, and loving gestures were exchanged until we were all resting on the border of turning in for the night. My mind was racing so naturally, I kept myself up and enjoyed a UFC event, enthralled by the magnificence in the melee of tactical combat. Quite a few ideas had anchored themselves onto me, and many more were to be sifted through and integrated once they became more definitive. The first idea that possibly carried the greatest load was how well I managed my panic and resolve in the face of genuine fear. There were countless times I was at the door of a true meltdown, wanting to scream for help and assurance of a stop button. I had a realization over the mental endurance that manifested throughout the worst parts of this episode. It wasn't laced with anything egocentric. It was a deep appreciation of the knowledge that I was a person who didn't collapse in fear when for so long I've shied away from anything emotionally heavy too often. I embraced the work that was necessary in a place where many would never contemplate venturing into, and rightfully so. This was most certainly nothing to be impulsive about. Beyond some of the more esoteric notions I'm still boiling, one of the best and more desired thoughts I gained was that of detachment. Detachment from the emotional codependency with my wife. I'm of zero service to myself and others if my mood and happiness are dictated by how she physically feels every day. A looming depression was settling in with all its powerful projections at the hand of not knowing how to let go. I grieved ruthlessly over the loss of a life I felt such sorrow and attachment to. And that life was still living, unintentionally grinding away at my hope and meaning. All due to the incapability of addressing the broken heart a devastating circumstance left in its wake. There's more room for optimism and progress when I'm unshackled from the negativity that lulls me into a static state. It is one thing to know and work on feeling a certain way. It's another when you viscerally believe and feel it. That was the magic I knew I would obtain if I was brave enough to put one foot forward. I leave this experience with a newfound respect and caution towards mushrooms. I got what I asked for and more. It is an uncomfortable feeling that I may have put myself in a real dangerous situation. The path to self-discovery can look ugly, sweating and twitching uncontrollably. I'd never want my family or friends to witness me in that way. But was it all required? It may depend on the presumed perilous outcome of not doing it. They say that the way you approach fear in this experience equates to how you approach or escape it in your real life. I guess one would say that in committing to a therapy like this, it exudes the perseverance of a person who's unwilling to accept a sad madness or total self-destruction. Unfortunately, I've exacerbated both of those options into a possible reality. But as I shed layers of this peel and reveal the healthier and capable person beneath, it forever devotes my quest towards more love, more strength, and the pilgrimage into my inner peace, however way that may look once settled and still.